Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. During this time of social and physical distancing, SACPA believes it's important to keep engaged with the public on issues of the day, and in order to do so, we are very thankful for the continuing support we received from the University of Lethbridge, Shaw Spotlight, and the Lethbridge Herald. Today we have as speaker Marco Luciano. Marco is the current director of Migrant Alberta. He was a student activist and a union organizer and educator before he moved to Alberta in 2013. Welcome to Alberta. He was also a co-founder to the Canada-wide Alliance Migrant Canada. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your talk, and we all do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annelise, and thanks to the Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs for the invitation to this online session. This is an exciting times for us. Again, my name is Marco Luciano. I'm the director of Migrante, Alberta, and I'm residing in Edmonton. I'm also acknowledging that I'm living in the First Nations land of Treaty 6. And just to talk a little bit about Migrante Alberta. Migrante is a migrants advocacy organization in Edmonton. We're also based in Red Deer and Calgary. And we're part of a national alliance in Canada called Migrante Canada, which is an alliance, a national formation that have approximately 12 member organizations. And aside from that, Migrante is also part of Migrante International, which is based in the Philippines. I'm a Filipino myself. And we deal with a lot of migrant workers globally, one of which is, of course, Canada. And we do a lot of work with migrant workers, those specifically under the temporary foreign worker program, the undocumented migrants and immigrants as well. And I asked to talk about, temporary foreign work during this time of COVID-19, these times of global pandemic. Just a note, though, that I would sometimes interchange the term TFW, or temporary foreign worker, with migrant worker. So that's just to take a note. And I guess I could start with the TFWP, or the temporary foreign worker program. Next slide, please. I'm not sure if most of you know, but just a brief understanding on the TFWP. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a federal immigration program that recruits workers from other countries to fill in the so-called labor needs of Canada. It generally have three streams. The caregiver program, or formerly known as the live-in caregiver program, or LCP. They take care of children, the elderly, and the sick. There's also the temporary foreign worker program, low wage, low skill project, and the agricultural seasonal agricultural workers program, or SOP, as many people call it. So the caregiver program is, like I said, it takes care of children, the elderly, and the sick, and they have access to permanent residency. The caregiver program also has its roots since the 1900s. The European domestics, the women from England, Ireland, and Finland came to Canada as nannies, housemaids, or governesses. But they are immediately and automatically given permanent residency upon arrival to Canada. By 1955, the program changed. It was called the Caribbean Domestic Scheme. The Caribbean women from Jamaica and the Caribbean islands were recruited to come to Canada. But a limited number of caregivers under the program were given the ability to apply for permanent residency after 1 year working as in domestic work. However, women are subjected to frequent pregnancy tests at that time, and they're paid less compared to their European counterparts. By 1981, the program evolved. The government changed the program to be called Foreign Domestic Movement, where caregivers, they still face exclusionary policies and endure workplace abuse, but it was a time where caregivers were granted the right to apply for permanent residency after working in Canada for over 24 months. This program continues to evolve. By 1992, the live-in caregiver program, or LCP, was introduced. It's pretty much the same kind of program, except that they added on the live-in requirement and become more restrictive. So the caregiver now have to live in their employer's homes, that can be accessed 24/7. However, just in 2014, then federal minister, immigration minister Alexander, and of course the EDLC minister Jason Kenney, at that time, the federal government, started holding closed-door consultations to eliminate the caregiver's right to apply for permanent residency. At that time, of course, there is a movement that built up on it, and by 2016. After Justin Trudeau was elected, he made changes to the caregiver program and made a faster pathway to permanent residency, while restricting also and putting the cap to the whole program. The next program would be the TFWP low skilled. It was a pilot project, right? They're in the service sector, low wage industry. You'll find these workers in fast foods, in hotels, meat and fish processing plants, vegetable and packing, etc. The temporary foreign worker program, that project was initially created in 1973. It was to facilitate the so-called economic growth in Canada by responding to the labor shortages at the time. Initially, it's a skilled worker program where it was initiated by the father of Justin Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, at that time. And then in 2002, they opened up the temporary foreign worker program project to low-skilled, quote-unquote, low-skilled workers, and that by 2006, this program have tripled. There are many migrant workers that come to Canada, and Alberta has to become a destination for these migrant workers. So migrants in Alberta bloated. They came to provide services, to the workers in the oil industry. So you'll find them in hotels in Fort McMurray, in Edmonton, in restaurants, and so on and so forth, to provide support to oil workers. And also, the next one is the SOP, or the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. It was introduced way back in 1966. So it was there was an agreement with Jamaica to recruit workers to work in farms. But these workers cannot generally apply for permanent residency. So they work in big farms, corporate farms. They work in family-owned farms. They come in March and they leave in October. They just arrived actually in Canada recently in April because of the lockdown. They're not able to come in immediately. And this cycle have been going on for the last 54 years. So they come and go. They never stayed in Canada, or they're not allowed to stay in Canada. And migrant workers, in this COVID times, migrant workers, agricultural workers, were prevented from coming to Canada during the early stage of COVID. So around April, they were locked out. They're not allowed to come. By April, they start coming in slowly. But when they were let in, there were no concrete policy on how farm work should operate, how it should operate, except being told to social distance themselves, right? And it was in the farms in BC where one of the first outbreak was reported. So if you look at the whole temporary foreign worker program, it's really the migrants that came through that program is integral to Canada's food chain. Migrants plant our food, they prepare our protein, sell it in groceries or serve in restaurants. There are also migrants even in the food delivery business. You know? So migrants are very integral to Canadians and Canada's food security. Next slide, please. Um, so people ask, why do migrants leave, right? The UN calls it, the drivers of migration or the root causes of migration, right? There are many, many reasons why people leave, and the common reason is, of course, the socioeconomic conditions of country of origin, such as poverty, unemployment, underemployment, political situations as well, like wars, occupations, political unrest create refugees and displacement. A concrete example from my country, where I came from, is Canadian mining. Canadian Mining Corporation displaced a lot of people in rural areas of the Philippines, and many of those rural areas are ancestral lands, that being displaced by Canadian mining corporations. Where would they go? They would try to go to urban centers like Manila. But since the Philippines have no industry where they can absorb a workforce, there's no other place to go but abroad. They try to work abroad. Of course, in the last 20 years as well, there are more climate-induced migration due to climate change, right? It's either drought that creates, untillable lands or hunger, or, rising sea levels at coastal regions that create displacement. There's in the last 10 years, there's unprecedented natural calamities that's happening globally, and of course, here in Canada, we feel it in terms of winter seasons or heat waves. And the graph in your screen show the 2019 UN report, that there's approximately 272 million migrants globally now that are moving around. And 74% of those are working age people. One common thing in this era, though, is an era of neoliberal globalization. Migration for majority of people is not a choice, and I want to make that point. It's not a choice. People are forced to migrate because of these conditions. And I'll give you next slide, please. I'll give you some concrete, case study. Like the Philippines, where I came from, is close to me, and it's where my family still are. Philippines, as a migrant-sending government, have mastered the systematized migration, like many other governments. But Philippines have been doing that since the 70s. They've been sending people in Saudi Arabia during the oil boom in the 70s, and so on. So for the Philippine government, migration is a matter of government policy. They call it the LEP, or the labor export policy. It turns Filipinos into commodity, like any product that they export abroad. LEP also is the Philippine government's employment and anti-poverty strategy. Because of high unemployment back home, the Philippine government becomes a broker that sends its people to work abroad. Canada is a favorite destination, as it was brokered as one of the few countries that provide pathways to permanent residency. LEP is also an anti-subversion strategy. Sending people abroad prevents social unrest. With high unemployment rate and extreme poverty, people will definitely rebel. And lastly, it is an income generation for the government. Migrants send dollar remittances to their families, creating huge dollar reserves. Next slide, please. Currently there are approximately 10 to 12% of the population of the Philippines, which is 103 million, that are living and working abroad. There's over 6,000 Filipinos that leave the country every day. So if you get a chance to go to the Philippines, you'll see the airport. It's structured in a way to support this migrant workers leaving the country. The Philippines is the largest exporter of domestic workers in the Asia Pacific. in the Middle East, and of course, caregivers here in Canada. And the labor export policy is specifically designed to systematize this migration. On the other hand, though, the Filipino migrants send approximately 23 to 30 billion a year, to their families back home. We're the third largest in migrant group that send money to their countries, next to India and China. For Filipinos in Canada alone, we send here from Canada, 1.2 billion US dollars per year. So aside from that, the Philippine government also collect money, approximately $750 per migrant worker, and that's amount to $1.6 billion per year to be able to go outside the Philippines and work abroad. So they collect money from migrant workers in order for them to leave the country. In essence, like, everybody really makes money out of a migrant worker. Agencies at home, sending governments, travel agencies, loan sharks. Where a lot of migrants borrow money to be able to pay in order for them to leave the country. Local brokers and immigration consultants here in Canada, and of course the Canadian government starts charging a lot of money in order to process papers. Migration has become a business for Philippines and many sending countries. Next slide, please. Of course, when they come to Canada, there are many issues that's attached to their work. Some of the common issues are lack of labor mobility, or their visas tied to one employer, and then that's a problem generally because the worker becomes subservient to the employer. A concrete example is that's one of the issues in the meat plants now in Cargill and JBS. There are migrant workers that works there, and they have been recruiting migrant workers to work in their facilities, and migrant workers are pressured to go back to work. In a workplace that is the epicenter of COVID in Alberta, right? And of course, they're afraid to go to work because of the situation. Because in Cargill, for example, there are now 3 deaths, in the workplace and in the community, that's related to the plant. At the same time, these workers are also afraid to lose their jobs, because for them, losing their job means deportation. The fact that their visa is tied to their employer, it's hard for them to say no to go to work. So those are the hard choices that many migrants in the meat plants are faced now. One other example are caregivers. Their visa is tied to their employer, and they live in their employer's home, so it's really hard for them to file a complaint, and go against the wishes of their employer. They are working 24/7, while the labor standard have defined work hours. Anytime the child that they're taking care of knock on their doors, they open, right, and they play with them, thus taking care of them, right. Their employer, anytime they wanted to go out and watch a movie, they could easily knock on their door and say, what, can you take care of the kids? We're just watching a movie. So they're tied, to their employer, and many of them cannot say no. Migrant workers also are indentured workforce, right? Migrant workers experience abuse at the hands of third-party recruiters. Many of them are guised as immigration consultants, in Canada, and pay thousands and thousands of dollars for various applications or assistance throughout the process. It's illegal practice in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia, but in Alberta, many still get away with it, and they're paying approximately, from $5,000 to $20,000 to recruiters and brokers. They're also faced with cultural isolation, um, since they're indentured, to the employers. Many of them can't leave their workplace. They lack government access to government bodies. And not only that, they, like I mentioned earlier, their fear to seek assistance is they don't want to aggravate the relationship with their employers because their visa is tied to their employer. Lack of access to permanent residency, long family separation. We know all the sad stories. I'm not going to go through it. Being separated from their child. There are stories where, a migrant mom will take care of other people's babies while they leave their baby behind, right? For long periods of time. And of course, racism and discrimination, are very, it's heightened, when the crisis hits. It's the migrants that are usually people of color, the minorities are the scapegoat of this crisis. We experienced that during the economic downturn in 2016 until last year, where migrants are being blamed for stealing Alberta jobs, right? Now, of course, COVID comes. We hear, even from, the first reaction of the lead physician, the lead doctor, Dr. Henshaw, in the news, saying that workers in Cargill live together and carpool, which is the source of the so-called, COVID in the meat plant, and it created a lot of backlash in the community. And I think you've read the news, right? Next slide, please. So aside from that, Canada relies heavily on temporary workers. They've been doing that for the last 100 years. They provide workforce to jobs that Canadians don't take. They cheap and disposable workforce. So Canada had become a revolving door for migrant workers. And the Alberta Federation of Labor, for example, have tracked the use of TFW program, and they show that the program does not really respond to the labor gap, but instead they were used to drive down wages. They used to pit workers against workers. Going to our campaign, can you go to the next slide, please? Many of these migrant workers, when they try to apply for permanent residency, have fallen into the cracks. Many of them have made this hard decision to stay and just work here, even way below minimum wage. And so, staying in Canada without status means that you also lose your ID, your access to public services, and of course, in times of pandemic, it is they're mostly the vulnerable ones. They lost their jobs before everyone did. They can access the emergency relief benefits, and of course, they do not have a valid Alberta health card. That means they cannot access healthcare as well, and that's a problem for us in times of COVID, because for a migrant worker who's undocumented, not only they're fearful of coming out and being identified as an undocumented worker and being deported back home, they would just stay at home, and Google, cure, right? And they put not only their lives at risk, but they put their neighbors at risk. They put our communities at risk. So since then, we have called the Canadian government and the Alberta government to provide access to healthcare, to remove the barriers for these undocumented workers, and let everybody access healthcare and support. So those are our current campaigns in Migrante, Alberta, and I'll stop there. But also, what can you do to support Migrante and the campaign? Your viewers can send a letter to the health minister, or send a letter to your MLA. The link is there. So if you go to our website, there's a link there for AHS for All. Your organization also can write a letter of support to the health minister in support of the undocumented migrants to be able to access services, but also healthcare. But also we have this public information campaign called the Shareable Selfie Project, where it's fun. You take a picture, send it to us. Send us a quote on why you support the Alberta Healthcare for All, and title, and use the hashtag anytime you post it. But also, most importantly, it's important that you share the stories of migrant workers, not only the undocumented workers, but be able to learn more about them. They are our neighbors. They have the right to be here. There's, overused quote that if they're good enough to work here, they're good enough to stay here. They're good enough to contribute to the Canadian economy, and be part of our community, because they are here now. They're living with us. And if you want to reach Migrante, we have an Instagram account, we have a Facebook account. Look for Migrante Alberta. You may also email, our organization at migrantealberta@gmail.com. Thank you so much again for inviting me here, and I hope you continue to support migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very informative and powerful talk. We have some questions in the chat for you, and I'll go ahead and start asking those. So the first one is from Timothy at the Lethbridge Herald, our local newspaper here. Workers in the meat plants are unionized. How strong is the union's ability to stand up to management when unsafe policies, like seen with COVID-19, does it offset some of the pressures of being indentured?
The union, and I've talked to some of the union representatives that was there in order to collaborate. Their union, UFCW Local 401, have been calling for the longest time to close the meat plant, to shut it down. And it took a long time before Cargill actually shut it down for 2 weeks, and the union felt it's really not enough to be able to address the issue of COVID. JBS plant, for example, haven't shut down yet, and the union have been calling for for these companies to close. And I think the union have been doing a lot in terms of really putting some pressure to the company, and also have done so legally in making sure that the workers that go inside are safe. As I understood, the union also have been supportive in ensuring that the workers in Cargill and JBS are able to get the CERB, or the Canada Emergency Relief benefit, as well as providing them support in applying for the OHS, the Occupational Health and Safety complaint. So they have been trying their best. However, of course, they're not able to close it down. They will not be able to pull out the workers, because it's deemed illegal. So they're doing their best legally to mitigate the issue and ensure health and safety in their workplace. Migrante have been doing work with them in terms of filling the gaps for those workers who's not able to get their money from CRB or OHS, and provide them with groceries and things like that. Some stopgap measures.
there we
Go
go.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'm actually going to skip the queue because I see that Timothy has a follow-up question. So I'm actually going to skip to his follow-up question and then go back to the queue. Can temporary foreign workers legally strike in unionized environments?
If a temporary foreign worker is a member of a union, they are part of the whole membership, and of course, strikes only happen if the workers wanted to go on strike. So the union needed, I guess, simple majority to ensure that those workers wanted to go on strike. So as a member of the union, temporary foreign workers is, it equalized, the playing field in terms of their rights in the workplace. And many migrant workers are non-unionized, but for workplaces that are unionized and hire migrant workers, they are definitely part of the union. They're part of the collective agreement, and whatever's in the collective agreement is can be availed by by a migrant worker.
Okay, our next question is from Knut Peterson. Are some temporary foreign workers recruited in the Philippines against their own will?
I would say no. Although there are cases of trafficking, there are cases of misrepresentation. There are many cases of having wrong contract. So for example, a migrant worker will sign one contract, and when they go to the country of destination, a different contract was signed. There are cases here in Canada where they would sign something in the Philippines, and when they come here, they don't get the same amount of income that they should be getting when they first sign. So when we talk about forced, it's really they're not dragged from the streets and go to work, forced to work. They were forced to leave the country because of their socioeconomic conditions. But oftentimes, when they go to countries of this destination, things are different.
Okay. Our next question, well, it's not so much as a question as it is a comment from Ted Mitsui. Sounds so familiar. I saw the same system in South Africa until 1994. And I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you'd like me to go to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, migrant labor is, the way it's structured currently globally, and in some cases, the temporary foreign worker program as a, modern day slavery, right? It is a, they put migrants into a situation where they cannot say no, because of, again, it is this structure where the work permit is tied to one employer, right? So whatever the employer says, in order for a migrant worker to be able to stay in Canada, they are forced to do what they, in some cases, of course, they cannot take it anymore. They leave, they file a complaint. But for many migrant workers who thinks about their family back home, who thinks about the income that they make for themselves, but also a chunk goes back home, they think twice before they file a complaint, and oftentimes they endure this abuse.
Laurie Schultz has the next question. Can the LMO, the labor market opinion, and provincial TFW contracts be strengthened to prevent abuses?
Yeah, LMO, there's a new requirement now. It's called LMIA. So it replaced LMO, the labor market impact assessment, they call it. I think the whole LMO or LMIA requirement is not needed. No? It's not needed by because that definitely ties the worker to their employer. By providing these workers an open work permit, where they work where they were hired to work, but when abuse happens, they can easily move employers, or find another employer. At the moment, because there's an LMIA that's tying them to their employers, they cannot do that. No, so definitely there can be lots of improvement, but of course, in the end, if Canada really says that there's a gap in the labor market, we need workers in farms, we need workers in fast food, then these are not temporary workers. These are permanent jobs, right? So it's really important to look at that if they come here and they're filling the gaps of those labor, then they should be coming as permanent resident, and have equal rights like any other worker.
Okay. Our next question is from Henning Mundell. How low are some of the salaries? Are the salaries from documented and undocumented workers different?
Yes, the salaries of documented, those who have work permit, depending on the work they do, but the low skill, the quote unquote low skill workers, they make the minimum wage, right? On paper. So on paper, they make between $15 in Alberta to $20 an hour, and then of course there are cases where employer would cut wages depending on what kind of work that documented migrants that's a problem, right? Because no one regulates the money that they make. Because they have no work permit, they receive cash, and there are oftentimes below minimum wage. There are cases where we hear or undocumented migrant worker would come to us and say, they're getting paid $7 per hour. They're getting paid $9 per hour, right? So employers really benefit from these undocumented migrants. One, because they're cheap labor. They're easily disposable as well. They're threatened to expose them if they complain. So many of them, take the abuse and get $7 an hour or $9 an hour. This is still more than what they will make back home, right? So yes, there are discrepancies between the wage of undocumented migrant and those that have work permits. But also they are even with those that are in with work permit, it's really below living wage, right? The wage that people need in order for survive. They're working class Canadians, like any other working class Albertans. I think in order for us to be able to really develop our economy in Alberta is all Albertans, regardless of their status, should be getting living wage, right? They should be shopping in Alberta. They should be paying rent in Alberta with living wage salary.
Okay. Our next question is from Laurie Schultz. Is an individual able to apply to become a temporary foreign worker without using a recruiter or broker in the country they are migrating from and Canada? They would, how would they learn about available jobs independently?
For Filipinos, for example, well, I think in a broad strokes, yes, they can. If they're in Canada, so they can, if they lose their job and trying to look for a new LMIA, they could definitely apply without, hiring an immigration consultant or a broker, right? However, in countries like the Philippines, and I think Mexico as well, in the Philippines, they make it a policy. Migration is a policy in a way that the government controls the out migration, and they do this through creating bodies that required migrants to hire quote unquote government licensed recruiters, right? So no migrant worker can leave the Philippines without going through a recruiter. There's this policy called no direct hiring policy. So, for example, a McDonald's here cannot just go to a community in the Philippines and hire individuals, right? They have to go through an agency back home. And that creates a systemic and systematic flow of out migration, while the government makes money not only from the remittances like I mentioned earlier, but also there are fees that are required, these that migrants have to pay to be able to leave the country. So there are countries that need brokers or agencies to be able to leave the country.
Okay, our next question is from Bev Mundo. I thought the issue of being here was being addressed to avoid abuse. Who would work on this?
The immigration policy is a federal policy. Is taken care of by Canada. The federal government. The federal government, through its immigration ministry, facilitates the flow of migrants, and that includes, the workers coming into Canada. They work in collaboration with the employment and the employment ministry, in order for migrants to control or to manage migrants coming into Canada. So definitely, it's through those bodies that we need to lobby, we need to push for changes.
Okay, and the next question is from Bill. Are undocumented migrant workers able to be members of unions?
Unfortunately, undocumented migrants cannot work, quote unquote, legally, because they have expired SIN. So if you have expired SIN, many employer will not hire you because it involves taxes, it involves many things. So an undocumented migrant worker cannot work, but they work. They do under the table jobs. Jobs that are. We call them 3D, dirty, dangerous, and forgot the other D, but demeaning, so a lot of them are in those of work. So it's hard for a union to organize undocumented migrants because of that, or include them in the union. However, there are migrants are organizing themselves. They have undocumented migrants are the most creative people that I've ever met. The fact that they're living in Canada, in Alberta, not being seen. They have they have an apartment. They work. They have families. There are many undocumented migrants that have children, Canadian-born children. As a matter of fact, in the province of Alberta, before 2017. Canadian-born children of undocumented migrants are not, cannot access healthcare. So imagine that if you're born in Canada, but your mom seems to be an undocumented migrant, you cannot access healthcare. Only in 2017 that we lobby to include Canadian-born children to undocumented moms access healthcare. But in the end, they cannot access the federal benefits for a Canadian-born child as well, just because their moms, they're punished because their moms are undocumented. So yeah, I mean, those are the situations of undocumented workers.
Trevor Page, as an essential element of Canada's economic well-being, how involved are our MLAs and MPs in defending the basic human rights of temporary foreign workers?
Oh, that's a tricky question. But it, personally, migrants cannot vote, period, right? Um, when we talk about MLAs, when we talk about MPs, they take care of people that vote. If you can vote, you could be a voice of a migrant worker. So definitely they would definitely address concerns of migrant worker, many of which, if they are being lobbied or by organizations or by Canadians, but the fact that migrants cannot vote, it's hard for them to voice out their concerns to MLAs, to MPs. They are always at the bottom of their files, right? And from time to time, being used as in campaign, right? So I'm a little skeptical, but on the other hand, as well, we have MLAs that has been working with us, and have been really campaigning for the healthcare for all, for example. Many of the current opposition in the Alberta legislature, have been supportive in the healthcare for all, and have sent out a letter to the current government to include everyone, regardless of their status, in the midst of the global pandemic, healthcare. No, so I thought this really a very good gesture from the NDP, to push and ensure that all Albertans are safe, not just the ones that are permanent residents or citizens, but more so those that cannot access healthcare. No?
Okay, our next question is from Laurie Schultz. In Alberta, there was a Labour Standards TFW inspection unit. Under the current government, has the dedicated TFW and OHS inspection unit changed, or does it still exist?
Even before, there was that inspection unit. There are some issues with that unit. It is a body that was designated by the government. However, it just does not have a machinery to do inspections. I'll give you an example. Caregivers, for example, the caregivers, domestic workers and home workers are defined as workers under the employment standards of Alberta. However, homes where they work are not considered workplace, right? It's a private place where a government body cannot just walk in and inspect, right? We have a complaint-based system where a migrant worker needs to complain before inspection happens, right? And that's a problem. And I mentioned that earlier, that not many migrant workers will complain because of the current structure of the temporary foreign worker program. It is employer dependent. So migrant worker will not complain, and our current system is a complaint-based system. So if no one complains, no inspection will happen, right? And the fact that and that's a fact, because not many complaints has happened in the last years, until an actual organization or somebody else complained, for the migrant worker.
Okay, I have a question from Bev Mundell. I've heard of some employers who sell food to workers, putting them into a never-ending cycle of debt. to their employer. Your comments, please.
Yes, many, of course, when migrant worker comes here, many of them are first timers, not knowing Canada, and part of the contract that I was talking about earlier, the quote unquote other contract, right? Aside from what they signed, and many of the contract that they signed back home, or the countries of origin, for example, includes housing, includes board and lodging. But when they come to Canada, they suddenly charge, or they were forced to live in their employer's home rentals. So during the boom of the oil, of course, there's the height also of the influx of the temporary foreign workers coming to Canada, and many employers have bought several homes. While we have a housing crisis, these employers have bought several homes where they rent out to the migrants. There's also cases where migrants are picked up and brought to the workplace, and they pay those travel expenses, right? So the employer really makes a killing out of a migrant worker, right? And in those homes, we hear stories that they're packed. There's two people in one room, and they're renting, up to $600 per bed space. So there are those stories. It's not new. It has been a scheme by many employers since the boom of the migrant workers coming in Alberta. It's not just the food that they pay for, rent as well, and from time to time they pay travel to their employer.
Right. I think Laurie Schultz's question, or follow-up question, or it seems to be a follow-up question to Bev's. Are there problems with employers making unauthorized deductions for flights, accommodations, or fees that the employer may have paid to bring the temporary foreign worker to Canada?
Yeah, it's a common issue. Like I said, many of the contracts that was offered to migrant workers prior to coming to Canada includes travel, and that's the law, right? That's part of the temporary foreign worker program contract. But oftentimes when they come to their employer's home, or if they're caregivers, or they start working in the employer, employers start deducting their salary, for the amount of money that they have paid for a migrant worker. So that includes, the money that they pay the broker or the recruiter, the money that they pay the lawyer, the money that they paid, plane fare, airfare. It becomes a salary deduction, for these migrants, and many of these migrants don't know. They thought it's normal. They thought it's something that they needed to pay, until, of course, when someone told them that, that's part of your contract. They shouldn't be charging that. But again, I'm going to go back to the LMIA, or the employer-specific structure of the temporary foreign worker program, is that, they would just, swallow the bitter pill and say, like, it's okay. I'll make that money, right? Yeah.
Our next question is from David Major. How many undocumented workers are there?
Oh, those are the questions that many people ask. The media ask, government official ask, and it's hard to get. Those numbers are hard to get. However, though, there are published reports, research, based on the numbers given by settlement services and things like that, that in 2012 there are approximately 500,000 undocumented migrants across Canada. And in the province of Alberta alone, it's estimated to about 25 to 70,000 undocumented migrants in Alberta. And it's growing, it's a growing population in Alberta. During the time when we campaigned the city of Edmonton to make the city an access without fear city or a sanctuary city, we're trying to get those numbers, and we're being asked by those numbers on how many undocumented migrants in Edmonton. And we said that it doesn't really matter. One undocumented migrant is an important undocumented migrant, right? The city could help support those undocumented migrants by providing a safe space, providing the city to become safe for all Albertans regarding, or all Edmontonians regarding of their status. And we got that, I think, that status in October of 2017 or 2018, that Edmonton now is so-called access without fear city. It does not mean much, but it's a good start.
Okay, we have a question from Kenneth Peterson regarding healthcare. Have you heard of people being refused such during COVID-19? So being refused healthcare.
During COVID-19, there was a memo or that everyone can access testing, and everyone can be sort of cured, or they can go to a doctor in times of COVID. The problem with that, though, is that there's no public announcement for the public that they can actually do that without fearing of their status, without fearing of getting being reported to the CBSA or to the immigration. On the other hand, there's also no clear policy to healthcare providers that they can accept those that do not have the Alberta health card. So even they have this document that says everyone can access healthcare in times of COVID. There was no policy that announced that. Secondly, for those undocumented worker that do not have COVID, they still cannot access healthcare, right? Even before COVID, for example, there are a couple of undocumented mothers, that gave birth to, they were not refused, because it's their right, so they gave birth, but hospitals start charging them, up to $10,000, just to giving birth. It's the mom's right, it's their reproductive right to give birth. And now there are collection agencies that's going after them, charging them, this money with interest. So regardless of COVID or not, they cannot access, healthcare.
Okay, we have a question from Henning. Do the majority of employers bend the rules, or is that just an exception?
Many employers does, from time to time, and we know that even with our Canadian workers, right? Like the low wage workers with status, they always try to bend the rules too, but more so with migrant workers, with undocumented migrants. Of course, I'm not saying all of them. There are employers also that's very supportive. There are employers that actually offer migrant workers support and sponsor them to become permanent resident. But many of the cases that we get, employers are really trying to make the most out of their quote unquote investment, right? which is a migrant worker. But we get also calls from employers saying that how can they support a migrant worker? So yeah, I mean there are employers that actually violate their contract, but there are employers that actually support the workers.
Okay, this is our last question. Comes from Laurie Schultz. What one change could be made to improve the situation?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, at the maximum, it's really important to look at the temporary foreign worker program. The temporary foreign worker program is we find it's legalized trafficking, right? I think it's important to look at that in a way that if there's real gaps in the labor market, if there's real numbers that we need in Canada to work in our industries, they should be given permanent residence upon arrival, right? They don't need to become temporary, because this work is not temporary. Fixing my computer is temporary, right? But working in McDonald's is not temporary. But at the short term, I think those who are already here in Canada can be provided with an open work permit, where they could legally work. They could also be able to transfer employers when they face abuse. So I think there are many ways that we can do that if there's really a political will from our governments in all levels of government to support migrant workers and to support our economy and generate a really healthy workforce is to make it equal for everybody. Thank you.
Yes, so we have Knut Peterson, Laurie Schultz, and Bev Mandel all thanking you for taking the time to present to SACPA and for your presentation. I think this is...
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is the ending of our session. So I also want to echo our thanks. Our SACPA really appreciates your time. And I'm going to sign off now. If you want to... do you have a last comment before I sign off?
Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's always a good opportunity to talk to people and tell the story of a migrant worker. Many of our fellow Albertans, fellow Canadians do not know their life story, and this is a really good opportunity. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, we'll sign off and we'll see everybody next week.